A Self-Guided Tour of Saroyan, San Francisco by Dory Meyer. Read by Chris Garcia. About this tour. William Saroyan lived in San Francisco from 1926 through the 1940s and visited often after that. His mother and sister occupied the same house on 15th Avenue from 1939 until they died. The city has changed by leaps and bounds since those days, booming after World War II, and then again during the tech industry takeover. Most of the locations in this tour have been torn down or renovated completely, so they don't look much like they did when Saroyan roamed the streets. However, there are a handful of remaining buildings, notably those where he lived. Take a moment to appreciate the history of the city as much as the history of Saroyan himself, and consider what it might be like to tour his haunts with the man himself beside you. Home, 1910, 11 Gavin Street. In 1910, the Saroyan family briefly lived in a building at this location. William was not yet 2, according to the census. His father, Armagnac, worked as a preacher for the Salvation Army. This is not obvious from William's writing, but the proof is in the census materials. It wasn't long after this that Armagnac farmed chickens in Campbell, died of a burst appendix, and was buried in San Jose. The children then moved to the Fred Finch Orphanage in Oakland, while their mother worked in San Francisco. Postal Telegraph Branch Office, 1927, 405 Brannan Street. In 1927, Saroyan was manager of the Postal Telegraph Office, the youngest branch manager in the country. To him, this meant he was free to roam the streets of San Francisco during the day with no oversight. But being the boss didn't suit him, and he returned to clerking at other branches. This experience features heavily in the story 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in The Daring Young Man of the Flying Trapeze and Other Stories, a writer's declaration in The Whole Voyage and Other Stories, and in Places Where I've Done Time. Home, circa 1927, 123 Natoma Street. This location isn't mentioned often, but it was an early address for the Saroyans before they lived on Carl Street. Mentioned in A Writer's Declaration, The Whole Voyage and Other Stories. Breen's, 1928 to the 1940s, 71 3rd Street. Breen's opened in 1925 and was a notable dive bar and speakeasy during the Prohibition, where Saroyan gambled in 1928 and beyond. After changing ownership multiple times, it was finally auctioned off in 1979, sold to the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency in 1949. In 1949, the San Francisco Chronicle columnist Herb Caen described it. "You'll find bums and businessmen, newspapermen and socialites." The Kentucky and the Barrel House were two nearby bars, occasionally referenced as well. Saroyan mentioned Breen's in The Places Where I've Done Time, I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, and Obituaries, as well as in Births. Postal Telegraph Office, 1927, 651 Market Street in the Palace Hotel. In the late 1920s, Saroyan worked here as a counter clerk and teletype operator. This luxury hotel saw many famous patrons, whom Saroyan observed and wrote about sometimes. This is mentioned in Places Where I've Done Time and A Writer's Declaration in The Whole Voyage and Other Stories. Gelber Lilienthal Bookstore, 1930s, 336 Sutter Street. In 1937, Saroyan liked to visit the Gelber Lilienthal Bookstore at 336 Sutter Street, a place for writers and literary types. The shop opened in 1924 by antiquarian Leon Gelber and businessman Theodore Max Lilienthal. Artist Valente Angelo made the above woodcut of the location in the 1920s, when it had a high ceiling and a quaint Old English appearance. It was mentioned in Letters from Rue Tabot and Obituaries. New Begins, New and Rare Books, 358 Post Street. New Begins, opening in 1906, was all class. It sold Grabhorn Press books as well as signed first editions of contemporary authors Ambrose Bierce and H.L. Mencken, both of whom influenced Saroyan, and Saroyan went to work with the Grabhorn Press frequently later in his life. This would have been a place Saroyan frequented, even though it attracted socialites as well. Omar Khayyam's, 1938. 196 O'Farrell Street. Omar Khayyam's Middle Eastern restaurant was owned by George Mardikian, who featured prominently in William's life. They first knew each other in Fresno, where Mardikian had a lunch counter. In 1938, Mardikian moved to San Francisco and opened his basement restaurant, which featured Middle Eastern and Armenian food. Mardikian was an evangelist for convincing Armenians to move to the United States and sponsored many of them financially. During some of William's worst bouts of gambling, Mardikian lent him money. Though they had a long history together, theirs was a fraught friendship embroiled in money exchange. In the mid-1980s, a fire destroyed the restaurant. Saroyan talked up this restaurant in the book Let's Have Fun in San Francisco from 1939, as well as in a preface for Mardikian's cookbook, which Saroyan was not paid for, a sore spot for him. Postal Telegraph Company, late 1920s, Powell Street at Market. In the late 1920s, Saroyan worked here as a counter clerk and teletype operator. This is mentioned in a writer's declaration in The Whole Veiled and Other Stories. Turk Street, east of NS, 1920s to 1940s. Alleyways, gambling. Menlo Club at 30 Turk Street, bar and gambling. Turk Street Poker Club, Joe Bailey's, drinks and poker. This part of Turk Street is in the Tenderloin District, always considered one of the city's sketchier locales, where gamblers, prostitutes, and thieves roam the streets. This was also a fun place for a young man to go. In the early 1930s, Saroyan spent much of his time at Turk Street. It looks too different today to even compare, but some of the alleyways remains where you can imagine illegal gambling houses might pop up. This is featured in the story, The Turk Street Gamblers, in the collection I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever, Chance Meetings, and Obituaries. Postal Telegraph Office, 1920s, Taylor Street at Market Street in the Golden Gate Theater Building. In the late 1920s, Saroyan worked here as a counter clerk and teletype operator. This is discussed in Places Where I've Done Time and a writer's declaration in The Whole Veiled and Other Stories. Crystal Palace Market, 1930s, 8th and Market Streets. Saroyan tells us that this was a favorite haunt of his in the 1930s, a large city center market spanning many blocks. It was based on the markets of London. Across the street from the Orpheum Theater, it was a hub of activity that allowed Saroyan to observe his fellow man. This is mentioned in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure. Public Library, downtown, 1920s to 1940s, 100 Larkin Street. The downtown branch, opened in 1888, is the crown jewel of the San Francisco library system. Today, the downtown library holds a history center, which includes Saroyan in its biography collection. He rode the streetcar or walked to this location. This is mentioned in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure. In the public library, I examined only those books that could not be borrowed. The books of art, the reference room, and the books of patents. For there is nothing so instructive as man's foolish inventions, along with their preposterous illustrations. Vanity Fair Florists, 1931, 555 Geary Street. Where this parking garage stands today, William and his uncle Miron ran the Vanity Fair Florists briefly in 1931. Not much is known about it, but Forever Saroyan has an extensive collection of sketches drawn on Vanity Fair stationery from William's time there, mentioned in Places Where I've Done Time. Izzy's on Pacific Avenue, 1937, 848 Pacific Avenue. Around 1937, Saroyan frequented Izzy's Saloon. It was owned by Portuguese immigrant Isidore Gomez, and Izzy wrote in his journals, Izzy Gomez's was something else. Unique sui generis. It really was as portrayed in The Time of Your Life, except that it was also a hangout for hard-boiled, sophisticated newspapermen. They gave the place a rowdy, slightly underworld character of half-suppressed brawl. For meals, Izzy served thick, luscious steaks, French fries, and salads. He gave a considerable number of meals and liquors out for free, not just to starving artists, but to people he liked. The bar was demolished in 1952. It is mentioned in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, Letters from 74 Rue Tabot, and is the inspiration for Nick's in the time of your life. Saroyan Place, formerly Alder Place, dedicated in 1988 in North Beach. San Francisco is full of alleyways, like any city. This was once called Alder Place, but in 1988, San Francisco literary icon Lawrence Ferlinghetti successfully convinced the city to rename the alleyway near his bookstore, City Lights. Ferlinghetti was a friend of Saroyan, and was also part of the Beat generation with his buddy and Saroyan aficionado Jack Kerouac. Kerouac wrote about Saroyan's influence in his own writing. At the same dedication, Ferlinghetti announced the renaming of the alley across the street to Jack Kerouac Alley. William McDevitt's Bookstore, 1930s. 2079 Sutter Street. Bill McDevitt was an eccentric bookstore owner whose shop opened in 1918. McDevitt was a socialist leader, might have appealed to Saroyan's ideology at the time, though Saroyan was never an activist. This is mentioned in Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hang In Forever. Quote, Bill McDevitt owned a big, shambling, cluttered bookstore in San Francisco on Sutter Street, above Fillmore, and I used to go in there and browse, because print and publication, paper and binding, title page and margin, and all the rest of the business and reality of language and action has always seemed near to where I ought to be, something like my home and my way. Home, 1928 to 1929, 2378 Sutter Street, at the Visadero. William lived here with his family in 1928-29. He returned to this flat after a disappointing first trip to New York in 1928. From here, he could see the nurses working at the hospital across the street and fantasized about marrying one. This is mentioned in Places Where I've Done Time. Home, 1929. 1707A, Divisadero. William's mother didn't like the climb to the third floor in the Sutter Street apartment, so they moved to this location, a block away, in 1929. The stay here was very brief before they settled at 348 Carl Street, mentioned in Places Where I've Done Time and Obituaries. Home, 1930 to 1939, 348 Carl Street. After living in various San Francisco apartments with his mother and siblings in the 1920s, Saroyan landed at Carl Street, where he wrote The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. The family lived here in a second-floor flat from about 1930 to 1939. From this location, he could walk to the Sunset Library or go further to the downtown public library. This is where he became a literary sensation. The apartment is mentioned all over Saroyan's memoirs and in stories. To start, it is name-checked in 70,000 Assyrians in The Daring Young Man and the Flying Trapeze and other stories. Library, Sunset Branch. 1930s. 18th Avenue in Irving. Saroyan always loved the public library wherever he lived. In San Francisco, he would walk to the Sunset Branch on 18th Avenue and Irving, opened in 1918. Saroyan would sit in the library for hours, reading books, periodicals, anything he could educate himself and inspire himself. This location is mentioned in Not Dying. Home, 1939 to 1946, and occasionally beyond. 1821 15th Avenue. With money from his writing success, William purchased this row house for his family, where his mother, Takui, and sister, Cosette, lived until their deaths. They began living here in 1939. William lived here off and on for decades, with a basement studio to do his writing. This was his home base whenever he returned to San Francisco. The house is still owned and occupied by William's relatives and has a view of the Pacific Ocean. The residence is mentioned all over Saroyan's memoirs, but you can start with Sons Come and Go and Mothers Hang On Forever. Home, 1946 to 1948, 2727 Taraval Avenue. This row house was newly built when William, Carol, and the kids purchased it in 1946. He used the upstairs room as his writing space in his 1963 book, Boys and Girls Together. He writes, "The upper flat was a shambles, but it always was. It smelled of stale cigarettes because he smoked so much whenever he worked or tried to. It smelled of not being lived in, too, and of fog and book. Books he hadn't had a chance to look into yet, some of them on hand for months, not even unwrapped yet, piled on the floor and on the furniture. There were stacks of magazines mixed in with the books and manuscripts, pebbles and twigs and roots and branches of trees washed smooth and clean by the sea that he kept bringing home all the time. It was considered remote in San Francisco, far from the hustle and bustle, out on the avenues of the Sunset District. He spent time here and also in New York during the period they owned it, until 1948. Carol felt isolated in San Francisco with no local friends, so the family kept a flat in New York so they could be satisfied. Deeply in debt in 1948, William had borrowed money from George Mardikian and sold the house to him on September 6, 1948, for $22,000 to pay debts. In addition to Boys and Girls Together, the house is mentioned in Sons Come and Go, But Mothers Hang In Forever, and Palo in The Whole Vayald and Other Stories. Paul Elder's Bookstore, 239 Post Street. It was a special bookstore in that it held an art gallery and lecture hall within it. Elder made high art of bookselling. In 1943, Elder invited Saroyan to read from his breakout hit book, and Saroyan frequented this exciting space. Ocean Beach for Walks, 1930s, 1940s. Saroyan was known for his long walks from his home on 15th Avenue to the beach, some 30 blocks away. Some of these walks he spent alone, others with family or friends. The sculptor Benanimo Bufano was one notable walking partner, as well as the artist Hilaire Heiler. This is described in the 1939 travel guide, Let's Have Fun in San Francisco. Saroyan would often pick up attractive beach rocks and display them in his home. Optional near San Francisco locations. Former Tan Ferran Racetrack, 1150 El Camino, San Bruno. Former Bay Meadows Racetrack, 380 East 28th Street, San Mateo. Golden Gate Fields, 1100 East Shore Highway, Berkeley, still open. Fred Finch Orphanage, 3800 Coolidge Avenue, Oakland, California. 1911 to 1916 home.